We're here to talk about designing forms that help voters succeed. We'll do a quick presentation followed by a question and answer period. And we'll be sharing the link to a new template all about InDesign that makes it easy to share and create new forms. So next slide, please. My name is Tasman Swanson. I am the comms lead at the Center for Civic Design, and I am based in Baltimore, Maryland, and use she, her pronouns. So who is CCD? Probably a lot of you know us if you're joining us today. We work with election offices and organizations nationwide to create research-based design principles for forms, ballots, mail-in ballot materials, and other election materials. And our main goal is always to invite everyone to vote and to take part in the civic process. We believe that democracy is a design problem and that better design that's guided by research and best practices is going to improve the process for everyone throughout the process. So next slide, please. Today, we've got two wonderful presenters, Sean Isamu Johnson and Emma Werowinski. So these are two of our design researchers at CCD, and they have done an incredible amount of work on form design over the last year and building on lots of research that CCD has done over the 8 years that we've been around. So Sean is CCD's plain language lead. He has a background in linguistics and research methods to solve real world problems. He has worked to create accessible PDF forms, led research projects on the language of vote by mail ballot envelopes, and is currently doing research into the impact of plain language on ballot measures. He's worked with states including North Carolina, Maryland, Vermont, Pennsylvania, and others on form design. So Emma is CCD's information design lead. Her work translates bureaucratic information in order to alter people's relationship to power. At CCD, she works with states and jurisdictions that are rolling out ranked choice voting, and she recently worked with the EAC to design a suite of tools to help visually explain the ballot verification process for poll workers and observers. They've got a wealth of knowledge on form design, and I'm so excited to pass the mic over to Sean to lead today's discussion.
Thanks, Tasman. I'm so excited and surprised at the reaction and the amount of people that registered for this. So I'm really excited to talk about the work that we've been doing for the past year or so on forms. And so today we're going to cover a lot of different things. Everything we're going to talk about has to do with forms. I'm going to go over a little bit about, why do we want to make better forms? And this is kind of the theme of a lot of what we're going to be talking about. We look at the voting experience, but we also want to make the process easier for elections offices and elections officials too. So better design tools for you means a better experience for voters. I'm going to give a little bit of an intro on the sidewalk style form. You've probably seen some version of it and might know it by some other name. So I'll give a little bit of background on that. And then I'll give a little bit of an intro about what the template can do. We won't have time to go over everything, but I think that will give you a good basis for understanding what the template can do. And then we're going to wrap up with a Q&A because part of this is knowing how you might use these tools. We are constantly trying to improve your experience, so we want to hear from you. So if you have questions or suggestions, we want to keep that line of dialogue open even after this presentation today. All right, so you can answer this question in the chat. You can just put a number. Does your office use InDesign to create, oh, cool, I see the polling quizzes, that's cool. Does your office use InDesign? Basically, on a scale of 1 to 3, you can use decimal points if you want to increase the power of your scale. But basically, not at all, yes, a little bit, and yes, definitely, we're really good with it. And so I just want to take this opportunity to mention, Tasman said I have a background in linguistics. I don't have a background in visual design or graphic design. My kind of interest and how I came to do this was born out of a need to have to do this. And in working with elections officials, I have realized that I am just like you in so many ways, that a lot of you don't have graphic design knowledge. So when Emma was brought on staff, we kind of teamed up to use her graphic and visual design knowledge and my kind of plain language knowledge and my frustration with forms to create this template. And so I want to reiterate the point that you don't need to be a graphic designer to use this tool. There's a little bit of knowledge that goes into it, but hopefully we will be able to support you in learning those skills. All right, so big question, why better forms? Why do we need to create better forms? I just want to look at the results real quick. Oh, cool, so many people have design wizards on staff. I'm so happy to hear that. Okay, so this is a list, not an exhaustive list, but a list of problems that we've come across. The biggest one is that voters make the same mistakes on forms. So, you know, whether it's forgetting to sign or providing an ID number, it's a really common mistake. There's also the administrative aspect of it. Like a lot of voters don't know which forms they need to fill out to fulfill their purpose, the thing that they need to do, or they don't know where to submit their forms. So those are like voter problems. But then we also have encountered these problems with that elections officials face. So, you know, small changes on the form take forever because the way that it was built didn't accommodate changes and updates. And that the accessibility or the interactivity, I'm going to use these words kind of interchangeably, but I'm going to use accessibility, interactivity, and fillability, all these really long words, all to kind of mean the same thing. And that often breaks, meaning that the form is no longer fillable or accessible anymore. And if you have any other like problems that don't fall under these umbrellas, go ahead and type them in the chat and I'll look through them later because we're constantly curious about what kind of problems you all face. So as I mentioned, we're always thinking about the voter's experience. But we also think that if you as an elections office, if you're facing like a problem, if you have a barrier, then that has like negative downstream effects. And usually that gets kind of dumped on the voter. So we want to make life easier for voters by developing, you know, a form design that works well and developing good plain language guidelines. But then we also are thinking about you, like how can we help you use better design tools and explaining them better so that you can serve your voters better. And the whole point of this talk is like, how can we like templatize that process? How can we like make it so you don't have to start from scratch every single time? And so this is kind of the like bare bones version of what CCD does. We do research and design, and our research is very diverse. We pull from a variety of sources. We pull from academic research. We're very interdisciplinary on our staff. We draw from linguistics, human psychology, things like nudging, user experience. We have somebody on staff, Anna, who's done research in eye tracking. So seeing like where your eyes stop and move while looking at a form. So yeah, we're very diverse in even the academic research that we draw from. We also do a lot of our own research. So most notably, we do user testing. So we test the materials, we put them in front of voters and elections officials, and we watch them complete the process, and we improve the materials based on the experience that they had. And we do other things like listening sessions, and we write white papers too. And then we also, the third part of this puzzle is that we work directly with election offices. So we do direct implementation. We create forms, we create notices and letters. We do the automatic voter registration screens at the DMV. And then we also do workshops like this. So we take all of these things, the academic research, our own research, and working directly with elections offices to produce resources like this template. And besides this template, we also produce field guides and one-pagers and just generally guides for you to use. And so the question is like, why should you use this template? And I imagine since so many of you came to this talk today that you're already interested in it. But the kind of pitch is that we want to show you how streamlined the design process in your office can be, and like thereby allowing you to provide usable forms to your voters. Like I mentioned, I don't have a background in this, so I truly think that if I can do it, then anyone can do it. And we know from our research that when you make better forms, that users make fewer errors. And then also there's like other kind of like secondary effects to having better forms design. Generally good and consistent design will promote trust and civic engagement. If people are able to recognize forms from your office, they're more likely to trust the whole process, we found. And then also by using this template, you'll find that designing and updating the forms is much quicker and more efficient so that you can, focus your time on other things like not designing forms. A big part of this is that the accessibility and interactivity are built into the template. They're not an afterthought. And we know that InDesign is intimidating. Emma is an expert on InDesign, and we still have things where we don't know the answer to. So we know how intimidating it is, and I imagine some of you will have to convince whoever's in charge of the budget that there is the budget for paying for an InDesign subscription. But we're hoping to kind of show you today that this investment is really worth it. We're not selling InDesign, right? Like we don't work at Adobe. We have a lot of negative things to say about Adobe too. It's not a perfect program, but the small investment in learning some of the basics of InDesign so that you can use their template, we hope you'll see that it's going to pay off for you. All right, so we're talking a lot about this thing called the sidewalk style form, and you might think, what the heck is a sidewalk style form? So let's see. We all know what bad forms are because they're really memorable, right? Like if you have to it's tax season, you have to fill out IRS forms. We can all complain ad nauseum about why forms are bad. The good forms kind of fly under our radar because we don't remember them. We fill them out and we're on our way. So when we think about what makes a good form, we think that, going off this theme that it should be usable for voters and elections offices, we think that a good form has to be easy for voters to find and identify. They need to be able to know that the form is the right form for them. And they need to be able to complete it accurately. If voters aren't signing the form like routinely, then that's more administrative work for you. So just more work in general for you. And then, of course, we want forms to be easy for elections offices to design and update. So like the kind of behind the scenes work. But then it also has to be easy to file and to process the after the fact administrative side of it. And so this is kind of what we mean when we say democracy is a design problem. If you are not able to easily design usable forms for your voters, then that barrier for you is like creating these barriers for your voters. And so this question we ask constantly at CCD is, how can we improve democracy by making design easier for people like you, or even people like us? And so in thinking about these questions, we began developing what we call the sidewalk style form. And so this is basically like the bird's eye view of the sidewalk style form. And one of the major considerations in designing forms is that a form has to obviously collect information from a voter. It's the main purpose, but it also has to provide information like instructions or even like restrictions. And we found from our testing that voters see this task of reading and understanding like instructions as different from filling in their information. So if you mix those two things together, voters get confused, we found. So the sidewalk layout separates these two distinct tasks. So on the left, you have the sidewalk. That's the information for the voter. It's the instructions. It's the information about the section, a heading. And then we have the curb, which separates the sidewalk from the form itself. There's also numbers in the curb, so it gives a reference if you need to refer back to another section in the form. And then the form itself. And this is the only part of the form where the voter is providing their information. And so we have a workbook that we've kind of explained the bigger picture principles on this. So the link at the bottom there. And Evie, if you can throw that in the chat, that would be really great. Thanks. All right. So we found that the sidewalk layout is extremely versatile. It works for a lot of different types of forms. We don't think every form should look the same, but the sidewalk layout works really well with a large variety of forms, especially really complex forms that have a lot of different requirements or different sections, or maybe like a kind of complicated logic. So forms like voter registration applications, mail-in or absentee ballot requests. Some states that have universal vote by mail will have something called like a mail ballot preference form. So if you want to opt out of voting by mail, you have to fill out a form. And then candidacy forms are extremely complex, with sometimes we've seen like 15 sections on one form. But even if you don't use the sidewalk layout, a lot of the things we're talking about today, like the principles will still apply. So although we're calling it the sidewalk layout, it's hardly like the biggest feature of the template that we're talking about today. But since we are talking about the sidewalk layout, we think that the kind of main selling point of the sidewalk layout is that it's predictable. We've heard this a lot from voters. Like we've heard things like, I know what's next. I know what section is next. You don't have to, we don't want somebody to have to search for the right section. We want voters to feel comfortable and almost intuitively understand what comes next. So this is a quote that we recorded from one of our usability testing sessions with a voter who's completing an absentee ballot request that we were testing. And forms are things that people read and fill out because they have to, not because they want to. And so we think that, and it's funny because a lot of people in usability testing sessions are extremely honest. They don't feel bad about saying anything negative about the form. So we think that anything positive that people have to say about a form is a huge success, because we know that positive experiences lead to higher engagement, trust between your voters and your elections office, and overall a better democracy. And so that was just something that I always remembered from this testing session, and kind of drove me to continue developing the sidewalk style form. All right, so we kind of talked a little bit about like the voters experience, and I want to talk a little bit about what the template can do. So we won't get through every aspect of the template. I want to reiterate that the template is kind of a part of like a trinity. There's the template, there's the workbook that Evie linked, and then we're gonna, I'll talk about this a little more, we're gonna produce some videos, very short, helpful videos for doing very specific things. And so like as we were developing this template, we just from our experience with working from like a variety of elections offices, we've come to appreciate the diverse needs of the many elections offices. So there are different language requirements. Some forms have to be bilingual or multilingual. Even the specific forms, like the one I mentioned about the mail ballot preference, there are only a handful of states that require that. And there are even unique ways of carrying out elections. Not every elections office carries out elections in the same way. And so as we started thinking about this, we realized we're a small team and we can't make forms for everybody. It's literally thousands, if not tens of thousands of forms that are floating around. So that's what led us to develop a template. And so the template is, it gives you the building blocks so that you can make your own forms the way that you want them. And so part of that process is taking our form or taking our template. So you download the template off our website. You will then customize the template to suit your needs. So if your state has to produce, or your office has to produce 10 forms, a lot of the elements across those forms will be common elements. So things like, I didn't know this until I started working at CCD, but the number of characters in a driver's license number ranges a lot from state to state. So if in your state, it's obviously very consistent, then you can customize what that field looks like, build it into your template. You can customize things like branding, things like the state seal, if you're going to put it, or county seal, maybe colors or fonts. All of these things that contribute to that unified and consistent look. You build that into your own template, and now you have your own template to work with, and then you build forms from that template. So this is not, like I said, an exhaustive list of the kinds of things in our template, but it's kind of the major points. So we have the sidewalk layout. So the template will be laid out with like kind of mock sections, but it'll have the all of the elements in the right places, and the idea is that you replace the elements with the things that apply to you. Things like auto sizing. I just got really sick of placing an image in an InDesign file and realizing that it was 40 times larger, and then finding the right tool to scale it down. So just being able to place things like the seal into a frame and have it automatically snap to the correct size is really, really helpful. We have an instruction sheet. I won't be talking about this too much. The workbook will go a little bit more into that, but it's a basic layout for an instruction sheet. It's like a 3-column instruction sheet. We're going to talk a little bit about the grid for easy alignment. So these are the things that we're going to be going over today. Emma's going to talk a little bit about how we have incorporated something called a baseline grid, which basically is just like the lines on line paper, so that you don't have to make little tiny micro nudges up and down. Using styles, there are many different styles. They're very intimidating, but we've done a lot of that work for you. We've created styles. There are character, object, and paragraph styles. And then something called anchor settings that I'm going to go into a little bit with like the actual form field design. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about how we've built in accessibility into the template. And I'm going to pass it over to Emma for a little bit.
Hi, everyone. So like Sean said, we're going to talk about some of the graphic design elements that are happening in this template that we've made. First of all, we all want our forms to look neat and tidy and easy to fill out. And grids are how we do that design-wise. Word processing uses a grid too, but something that might happen when you use Word, like if you have additional text boxes that you have to add to create 2 columns, you start to have to nudge them around to get everything line up. And it can be kind of a painstaking process. With InDesign, we let the computer do the math for us by building it into the template. And so all of that nudging doesn't need to happen anymore. It's automatically part of the template itself. And like Sean said, it's just like the same principle as writing on lined paper, except the computer is doing it for you. So what Sean called the baseline grid makes it really easy to fit and space out all the sections that have to go onto a complex form. So you won't need to waste your time nudging things around because it's built into the styles automatically. And I'm going to talk about styles on the next slide. The baseline grid, which is the blue lines that have popped up on this snapshot, is based on the size of the smallest text on your form. What it does, it's unifying the scale and the spacing of the headers, the instructional text, and the form text. It's automatically calculating the right amount of space to go between the paragraphs of text. It's automatically lining up elements across columns, and it's going to make all the forms that you make using the template visually consistent, no matter who is using the template to make them. So not only you won't need to waste time nudging things around, but this is also going to make the written information on a form look right to people. Sean spoke earlier about making voters feel comfortable when they're interacting with forms. And we know that people have a lot of anxiety when they're filling out a form because of past experiences. It can be kind of complex. You're giving personal information. And all of the graphic design that's built into the template, like making sure things are aligned, is going to help people feel calm and be able to understand what the form is asking them to without having to sort of like look around on the page and feel confused about where elements are lining up with each other. Next slide, thank you. InDesign also gives you a lot more control over the type than Word does, which is great for when you need to make adjustments later on to make things fit. So we've built out a lot of styles for the headers and body text in our template that will cover most of the situations that you're going to encounter when designing forms, so you don't have to worry about that ahead of time. So you can start with the text on the left, which is all of the copy that you want to go on. This is one column of the instruction sheet in our form, and easily apply the styles so that the headers and the bullet points and the text space out the way that you want them to. It's really easy to read and you understand the order of the information. So one example of this, next slide, John. Thank you. This is going to make it really easy to make changes. So let's say you have to make all of the headers slightly smaller because you put everything that you want to go onto the form, but you realize that a couple of lines are getting cut off, which that happens all the time, right? We have to squish it in. So before, you may have had to go into your Word document and like highlight every single header, decrease the size, keep doing that until you figure out the size everything needs to be to make all the information fit. What's awesome about styles in InDesign is instead of having to do that one by one, you can go in, you can change only one setting, and it's going to update, re-update all of the headers or all of the body text so things can fit. So it's really decreasing the amount of time that you will need in order to like edit things once you have all of the content on the form that you're making. And now I'm going to pass it back to Sean to talk about anchor settings.
Thanks, Emma. I know Emma only spoke for a little bit, but I really want to like emphasize that how important the baseline grid and the styles part of building forms is. Recently, like about a month ago, was the first time I had to really use this template for the first time on a new form. And just having those things just automatically snap to where you want them was just like such a lifesaver. And we were able to quickly produce, we were asked to do like a provisional ballot envelope, and just how quickly that went from our old workflow was enough for me to get excited. But I really think that with the right knowledge that anyone can do this, definitely. Okay, so now I'm going to talk a little bit about form fields themselves. Every form has form fields, obviously. And form fields are actually kind of complex. They don't seem complex, but they are. And if you're building an interactive or accessible form, they have essentially three objects. They have the field label. So in this case, that's last name. They have the field line, which is in this case, that gray horizontal object. and the fillable text field itself. So that kind of invisible object that's moving around. And that's where you would, the user would type in their information if they're filling it out online. So if you have 25 fields on your form, that gets out of hand really quick. You will often forget to move things around. And it makes doing the accessibility process a huge hassle. But what do we do? I was going to also mention grouping is an option. It's what we used to do, but ungrouping and regrouping to make changes becomes a huge pain. And it doesn't solve the problem with accessibility. What do you do when you have to have 3 objects per form field? Well, we found that if you anchor the objects, which means to embed the objects, then you're essentially only dealing with one object. So what we're doing here is we've taken that horizontal field line, the physical horizontal line, and the fillable text box, and we've embedded them next to the field label where it says last name. So when you move the field around, it moves all together, even though there are 3 objects. But as we found, messing around with the settings for anchored objects is extremely confusing and non-intuitive. It is definitely a higher level skill on InDesign. We had to do a lot of Googling to figure out how to get this right. But we've done that work for you. So when you download this template, you don't have to mess. Like I said, you don't even need to know any of this. In one of the videos, we'll talk about how, if you want to create a new form field, you can build it from scratch, which is pretty easy to do with the template. But the easiest thing to do is really just copy that whole thing. You just copy the whole thing and you have a new form field, you relabel it. When you do the accessibility part, you have to change a couple things, but it's much simpler this way. So having those anchor settings built into the template under object styles will just make your life much easier. And then we've been talking a lot about accessibility, and I just want to also reiterate again that by accessibility, we mean, we use this term very broadly. We mean making the form field fillable on one hand, so anyone who can download the form can fill it in Acrobat or even their web browser and then submit it by email. But then we also mean making the form possible to be filled out with somebody using like a screen reader. So people who are visually impaired use a screen reader. The screen reader reads what's on the screen. And so the user can fill out the form without even seeing the form. The problem is like that process is often done kind of after the fact. So we've seen this workflow a lot where an elections office will create the form in like Microsoft Word, take it over to Acrobat, do all of the accessibility in Acrobat. And then if you need to make edits, like say a substantial edit, Acrobat is not really the right program. If you've ever tried to make bigger than like tiny text edits in Acrobat, you'll find that spacing gets messed up really quickly. So you have to go back to the source Word file that has none of the accessibility built into it. So when you make changes in the Word file, when you export it, you have to redo the accessibility. And so, forms are usually kind of like living documents. Very few of them are evergreen. In fact, we've read a lot of laws that say that for every year, you have to produce a new version of this form to update election dates, or sometimes parties get removed. So if you have to make these edits like predictably every single year, this is not a sustainable solution, especially if you have to update multiple forms. And we know that just about every elections office we've worked with really struggles with making forms accessible. We want everybody to vote, even people who use like assistive devices. And if we're not making the forms able to be used with assistive devices, then we're essentially excluding people from voting. So what we've done is we've built in the accessibility into the template. So if you need to make updates, all of the accessible, well, not all, I would say 80% of the accessibility is done in InDesign. So when I was talking about the form fields, when you create new form fields, you're automatically creating a new fillable field. You don't have to do that process again in Acrobat. So the workflow gets simplified a lot. You create the form using the InDesign template. You really only use Acrobat to do what's called an accessibility check. You're just checking the document. It's not a complete check, but it's pretty good. And then if you need to make edits, you go back to the source file. And because all of the accessibility is built in, then once you're done making the edits, you really only have to repeat that accessibility check in Acrobat. And so we think that that's, I mean, we know that this is just a much better experience because it's a better experience for us, and we know it'll be a better experience for you. Okay, so we're wrapping up here. We're just showing you like a couple before and afters of forms that we've either we've created or other offices have created using the sidewalk form design. We just want to show you like what it can do basically. So we have a voter registration form, the original one on the left. We didn't test this one, but we know that it's kind of difficult to complete. We also heard feedback from the office that it was a lot of mistakes, and they have kind of unique requirements in the state about like a voter's oath, and you only fill out the oath if you're sending it in by mail. And so we took all of this information. We really didn't add very much or subtract very much, and we created this one on the right. And then this is an example of an absentee ballot request. Again, going back to like this idea that like you want the layout to be predictable. You want voters to look at it and immediately understand that this section is for instructions and this section is for the fields. The before version of this kind of has the instructions interspersed. You see some at the top, you see some on the right. And that creates a more kind of cumbersome experience for the voter. And sometimes we're not redoing a form. Sometimes there's like a new law that requires a new form. So this is an example of the mail ballot preference form I mentioned earlier. So in this case, there was a new law and they needed to produce a new form to accommodate this new law. And so we were able to quickly produce this form using the template, and you know, that way you're not bogged down in trying to redo this form. And this is a form that will have to undergo changes. So election A, B, and C are obviously placeholders there, but every year this form will have to be updated. So we know that there are a bunch more of these sidewalk forms that are floating around. Probably none that have used the template because we just uploaded the template, but we've been really pleased to see how many elections offices kind of run with this design. So we're really interested in seeing what you've created, whether with the template or not, but we hope you use the template. And we will add it to our, I just made this up. We don't actually have a sidewalk form Hall of Fame, but maybe we should. And so what's next? We are thinking about, you know, the template itself it's still an InDesign file. It can still be intimidating. So we are going to continue like synthesizing what we've learned after hours of Google searching and Emma's knowledge in graphic design. And we're putting together a couple of video explainers. We're going to have like, you know, stuff that deals primarily with the visual design aspect of it, stuff that deals with the accessibility part of it. We're also thinking about doing monthly office hours where people can just kind of drop in and, you know, troubleshoot things. Again, that's very open. It could be like, hey, I need to get this to fit on my form better. Hey, can you help us rewrite the language on this? Or hey, what's going on with the accessibility? Why isn't it functioning like I want it to? And then beyond that, we're constantly creating more elections tools. So we're looking at like, we have a couple people on staff who are doing language access materials. So like guides for you. The 2020 census happened, and a lot of elections offices are going to have to start thinking about, I hope you're thinking about providing materials in new languages. We are producing materials on ranked choice voting. We've worked a lot with New York City to produce guides for ranked choice voting. And besides that, we'd love to hear from you what you'd like to see. So if you ever have an idea of the types of materials you'd love to see, we want to hear from you. And that's it for me. And now we'd love to hear any questions that you have or any feedback. If anything that you want to see from us, we'd love to hear from you. So I'll hand it back to Tasman now and stop sharing.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Sean. We've got the chat room, and if you've got any questions or problems that you've experienced or seen in your own office with forms that you'd love to pick Sean and Emma's brains about, please throw that into the chat. I'm going to start off with a quick question that came up from Kathy Fisher about dual languages and how that's a problem that often comes up in her own work. So Sean and Emma, I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about when designing forms in jurisdictions where they support multiple languages, what are some of the things that you keep in mind?
I know actually Tasman can answer that too, because we work together in Maryland to do a lot of bilingual forms. It's like a long conversation, definitely. Bilingual forms or multilingual forms in general are really tough. There's this problem of like, do you make it back to back? Do you make it side by side? Do you make it like language one, language two, language one, language two? Catherine Summers, who is on our board and one of our advisors, is doing research on this exact question. We think that there's not a really clear answer yet. We've been like kind of monitoring what the academic research on this says. We think that it kind of depends on what you're producing. There are some obvious things, like if you need somebody to sign, you should not put 2 signature boxes or a signature box for every language. So, if you need a signature, you make the language above 1 signature box in 2 languages. Did you, Tasman or Emma, have anything else to add to that?
It is making me think though, Sean, that that's something, because the template as is built out in 1 language, obviously, that making a template in 2 languages is something that would be useful to a lot of people. So I'm like tagging that in my own brain as like another future tool, potentially.
Yeah, it reminds me of a conversation we had. We never actually got the answer to this. Maybe somebody here knows, if you're making a bilingual form accessible, how do you make the screen reader know which language it's reading? I don't know if there's like a clear answer to that. But I don't know if that answered the question, whoever asked that.
Kathy Fisher had thrown in a comment about dual languages being a challenge. Yeah, and I can say that one of the really cool things that was built into this template was the I'm gonna forget the name wrong, but the tooltips, like the readability stuff. And so by having it built out in multiple languages, that you don't have to retype those or retranslate them. That's a very cool feature of this. Another problem that Richard Radecki pointed out very early on in the chat was about balancing usability with statutory required language and information fields, and that being a big challenge. Sean or Emma, do you have thoughts on some of the things that you keep in mind when balancing legally required language with plain language and usability? Who's going first?
You go first.
I feel like, so obviously in the best case, you would be able to have a conversation with your legal team to see if it doesn't need to be there, to see if you can just write it in plain language to begin with. but of course that isn't always possible. So as an information designer, I kind of like have 3 techniques for how to do that. And the first is to essentially background that information. So if it's like it's like an entire paragraph of legal text and you can't change how you're going to write it, I like will make it smaller. So it's like not taking up a ton of space, and I'll write a plain language header above it so that people can read that same information, but in plain language. So they understand what it is, and you're fulfilling the requirement, the like legal requirement of having it on the paper by adding language. You can also sometimes do that by adding a visual, like if it's a very, very technical warning, you can add an exclamation point to it, so you can make it clear what type of information it is, again, while like not making people have to read it, because a lot of that legal text can be things that are really like hyper specific situations. And Sean, correct me if I'm wrong, but like things where, you know, very few people actually need to know that information. So we don't want to make everyone have to read it. We only want the people who absolutely need to read it to read it.
Yeah, I think the strategy of kind of like translating. So if a law says, we just worked on this form for a state that in the law it says, basically, if you don't complete this form, your voter registration can get canceled. But it was like 3 very, very long sentences prefaced by warning in all capitals. And so what we did was at the top of the form, we wrote, if something like, if you ignore this letter, your voter registration may be canceled. And then we put the statutory text at the bottom. So it's there, it fulfills the law. And it makes it better for the voter. Like the voter is still getting the message. We are actually adding more information, but just having that warning alone, we know from our research that voters do not respond to warning in all capitals and bold. It's just something that they gloss over. Another thing that you can do is like the order that things come in. So often people forget to sign because the signature is buried. So if those warnings and things like that can come in a way, like come after the signature, or you can lay it out in a way where you don't have to put it right around the signature and obscure the signature. That's another strategy. And I was gonna say one more thing. Oh, right. So depending on what the law says, we've seen a lot of ways that it's phrased. Sometimes it'll say something very specific, like must be in this exact form, quotes, and the exact thing. And then one of Emma's strategies might work for that. Sometimes it'll say something like substantially, which is like kind of your cue to rewrite it. And we can help with that, definitely. And then another final thing, we talk about this in the work that Whitney and I wrote a white paper on the language of vote by mail envelopes. If something's a list, then add bullets. There's nothing in a statute that says you can't add bullets. You're still retaining all of the same language, but if it's a list, like requirements to vote, make it into a bulleted list. It makes it more readable. And the workbook talks about some of those strategies too. Yeah. Thank you.
I just dropped the research that Sean mentioned into the chat. He was looking at vote by mail oaths on the back, or signature oaths on the back of vote by mail envelopes, and like little typography tricks, as well as much larger plain language fixes that can make them more readable. If there are other questions, please do throw them in the chat. I've got one more, and then we're getting close to the end of the hour. And that's about, Sean, you mentioned that, you know, sometimes statute will call for, you know, warning in all caps as a way to call attention. But you mentioned that that is not always the most effective way to get attention to an important piece of information. What other typography choices might be better to call out and get attention?
I'll split my time with Emma on this because Emma will have more to say about like the visual part of it. I think from a language perspective, headings that, rather than making the heading, I'm blanking on an example, but making headings descriptive. So make the heading the message and then have everything below the heading, the details of it, rather than making the heading something like voter registration. That doesn't tell anybody what the ensuing paragraph is about. But if you say something like, your voter registration may be canceled, or complete, like, help us count your ballot on a cure. We use that as a major heading in our cure materials. Help us count your ballot, not like notice of ballot rejection. Like, that doesn't tell the voter very much. So like using the headings to tell the person what to do, and like as like a taste of what the following paragraph is going to be. And Emma probably has something to say about like visual things like images and shading and stuff like that.
Yeah, or just like in making things important, a lot of things on a form are important. They just are. And I think when you're trying to emphasize that someone needs to do all the things, we like tend to add emphasis to everything. And something I like to say is that people can't read popcorn. So when like 3 things are bright red and 10 things are bold and like a ton of stuff is in all caps, you just made everything emphasized, and all of a sudden people no longer know like what the most important thing is for them to read. So the first thing I'll do is like take everything down a notch and make everything the same level. So like nothing is bold. We are just using a heading style and a body style. And then if there is something like a warning that you really want to call out to people, I will only give emphasis to that. And there's a couple ways to do that. So in our form, we always make the signature box red. It says required with red, and then the outline of the box is red. And because the required thing is the only thing that's red on the form, that immediately jumps out to people, and they recognize that that is a crucial thing for them to do. You can also do that by adding bold selectively to things that are warnings, or by adding little icons, like we use an exclamation point icon to symbolize something that's super crucial for people to read. And when you do that sparingly, the things that are really important, like those warnings or like those required sections, become super clear to people.